The curtain goes up at exactly 6 p.m. He is already there, strapped down, fur in his arm, eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the death chamber at Florida State Prison in Rayford. The man on the gurney is 64 years old. His name is Ronald Palmer Heath, and he's been waiting for this moment for 35 years. The warden steps forward. Standard procedure. One question. Do you have a final statement? Ronald Heath exhales. His eyes don't move. Then quietly he speaks. I'm sorry. That's all I can say. Thank you. 3 words. 35 years. 2 confirmed murders. A third he was never tried for. And a brother, still alive in a Florida prison, who pulled the trigger, while Ronald Heath got the needle. How does a man walk out of prison in 1988 after killing someone at 16, and within 6 months, help murder again? How does a jury vote 10-2 for death, and a man still spends more than 3 decades waiting on death row? And why did the family of his victim spend years campaigning just to get a governor to sign a piece of paper? This is not just the story of an execution. This is the story of 3 murders across 12 years, a broken system that let a killer walk free, a brother's plea deal that saved his life at the cost of his siblings, and the families who waited longer than most children wait to become adults. This is the story of Ronald Palmer Heath. If you've never heard this name, you need to. If you want to understand how Florida's death row really works, stay until the end. Hit the subscription button, like, share, comment, and turn the notification. Jacksonville, Florida, 1977. Ronald Palmer Heath is 16 years old. The details of what happened that year would follow him for the rest of his life. According to court records and testimony reviewed during his later capital trial, Heath encountered 18-year-old Michael Green in Jacksonville. What began as a confrontation escalated rapidly. Heath confessed to beating Green, first with his fists, then with a log, until Green was dead. He was 16. Green was 18. Heath told investigators that Green had made unwanted sexual advances toward him. The court accepted this account as a mitigating factor. He was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. 30 years. He served 10. Green's sister, Rhonda, would stand outside Florida State Prison nearly 5 decades later and say, "My brother Mike was a beautiful, loving person. My family has waited over 48 years for any form of real justice for my brother's brutal murder." 48 years. For a crime that sent the killer to prison for a decade and then let him go. In 1988, Ronald Palmer Heath walked out of Florida Correctional Facility. He was 26 years old. He had a record. He had served time for killing a human being, and the state of Florida handed him his release papers. 6 months later, he would kill again. This is the first crack in the foundation, the moment the system made a decision that could not be undone. A man convicted of murder at 16, sentenced to 30 years, paroled after 10. The question that haunted Green's family for nearly half a century was simple. If he had served his full sentence, would Michael Sheridan still be alive? No one can answer that. But the timeline speaks for itself. By May 1989, Heath was living in Georgia with his girlfriend, Penny Powell. He and his younger brother Kenneth had been spending time together. Kenneth had his own record, multiple burglary convictions, and had been released from jail just 3 months before the night that would define both their lives. The brothers drove from Jacksonville to Gainesville on the evening of May 24th, 1989. Ronald had friends who worked as waitresses at a bar on University Avenue near the University of Florida campus, a place called the Purple Porpoise Lounge. It was a dive bar, loud music, cheap drinks, the kind of place where strangers talk to strangers without thinking twice. That night, one of those strangers would be Michael Sheridan. Sheridan was 30 years old. He was from Atlanta. He was in Gainesville on a sales trip, a traveling salesman, the kind of job that means long hours, unfamiliar cities, and lonely nights in bars where you don't know anyone. According to trial testimony, Sheridan was friendly, outgoing. His family would later describe him as a man who took people at their word and trusted too easily. He bought the Heath brothers a round of drinks. He talked to them for less than an hour. He asked if they knew where to get marijuana, what locals apparently called Gainesville green. Ronald Heath said he knew a spot. At some point during that conversation, According to prosecutors and court records, Ronald Heath leaned toward his brother and made a decision. They were going to rob this man. Sheridan hesitated at the door. He had an early morning meeting. He almost didn't go. He went. The car stopped at a dead end. According to court records and testimony from the trial, Ronald Heath drove the group out of Gainesville and into a remote area of Alachua County, a stretch of isolated land where the road simply ran out. Trees on all sides. No lights. No witnesses. The three men got out and smoked marijuana. Then Ronald Heath made a gesture, shaped his hand like a pistol, and looked at his brother Kenneth. "Did you get it?" Kenneth reached into the car and pulled out a .22 caliber handgun. He pointed it at Michael Sheridan and told him this was a robbery. Sheridan didn't believe it at first. According to prosecutors, he thought they were joking. When the reality hit, he lunged at Kenneth. Kenneth fired. The bullet struck Sheridan in the chest. As Sheridan collapsed and began emptying his pockets, giving up his wallet, his belongings, Ronald Heath moved in. He kicked the man. Then he pulled out a hunting knife and stabbed Sheridan in the neck. Trial records indicate he attempted to cut Sheridan's throat, but the blade was too dull to complete the act. Sheridan was still alive. Ronald Heath reportedly told his brother to shoot again. To make sure, Kenneth Heath fired 2 more shots into Sheridan's head. Then both brothers dragged the body into the woods and left it there. They drove back toward Gainesville. They pulled items from Sheridan's rental car. The next morning, they used his credit cards at a shopping mall, making multiple purchases, trying on a new life while the body of the man whose wallet they carried was still lying in those woods. Days later, according to Duval County court records, Ronald Heath was connected to the killing of another man, 26-year-old Anthony Hammett, in Jacksonville. Hammett was shot to death. This case would never go to trial. But Hammett's sister, Kimberly Reeves, would stand outside the prison on the night of Heath's execution and say that Ronald Heath losing his life didn't bring her brother back. She didn't delight in the execution. She simply hoped he was at peace. 3 deaths, 3 families, 3 sets of people who would spend the better part of their lives waiting for some form of closure that could never truly come. Investigators eventually connected Heath to Sheridan's stolen credit cards. Several weeks after the murder, Ronald Heath was arrested at his home in Douglas, Georgia. Police found not just the credit card purchases. They found a watch that belonged to Sheridan, traceable by its serial number. It was sitting in Heath's possession, a dead man's watch. Kenneth Heath was arrested separately. He made a calculation. He entered a plea agreement, agreed to testify against his older brother, and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Ronald Heath refused to plea. He went to trial. That decision would define the next 35 years. Ronald Palmer Heath's trial began on November 5, 1990. He was 29 years old. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. Kenneth Heath, his own brother, took the stand and testified against him under the terms of his plea agreement. The watch recovered from Heath's Georgia home was traced directly to Michael Sheridan through its serial number. The credit card purchases at the Gainesville Mall placed him at the scene the day after the murder. And there was one more witness the jury would hear from: Heath's former prison cellmate, a man named Wayben Williams. Williams testified that while awaiting trial, Ronald Heath had told him he was planning to escape pretrial detention. More than that, Heath had allegedly told Williams he planned to kill 2 young women who could connect him to the murder. Williams said Heath had identified them by name. It was a devastating piece of testimony. Whether the jury believed it or simply filed it alongside everything else, the effect was cumulative. The evidence mounted. The jury found Ronald Palmer Heath guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, conspiracy to commit forgery, and 7 separate counts of forgery and uttering a forgery. On December 17, 1990, Judge Robert P. Cates sentenced Heath to death. The court found 2 aggravating factors supporting the death sentence. First, Heath had a prior violent felony conviction, the 1977 second-degree murder of Michael Green. Second, the murder of Sheridan had been committed in the course of an armed robbery. The mitigating arguments his attorneys presented included his age at the time of the first murder, his incarceration as a juvenile, the possibility that his brain development had been affected by years spent in prison during formative years, and the fact that the trigger was pulled by Kenneth, not Ronald. They also pointed to the substantial disparity. Kenneth Heath received life with parole eligibility. Ronald Heath received death. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and sentence in 1994. That was the beginning of what would become 35 years on death row. The legal machinery of capital punishment is slow by design. Post-conviction appeals, federal habeas petitions, remands, and reversals. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals weighed in. The Florida Supreme Court issued multiple rulings over 3 decades. Each time, the courts found the conviction sound. Each time, the sentence held. Death penalty opponents raised consistent objections. The jury's recommendation had been 10-2, not unanimous. Florida, unlike most states, allowed non-unanimous jury recommendations for death at the time of Heath's sentencing. Advocates argued that 2 jurors who voted against death meant something. The courts disagreed. His attorneys argued the lethal injection protocol was mismanaged. They argued the state's clemency process blocked due process. They argued developmental damage from juvenile incarceration. The Florida Supreme Court denied his final state appeals on February 3, 2026. The U.S. Supreme Court denied his petition the morning of February 10th, the day scheduled for his execution. Every door had closed. February 10th, 2026. Rayford, Florida. Outside Florida State Prison, more than 60 people gathered in the cold evening air. They held bells. Some had signs. A Catholic priest from Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Daytona Beach swung a censer. A protester from Iowa stood beside a woman who had been opposing Florida's death penalty since the 1980s. Someone sang Amazing Grace. Inside, it was different. Sheridan's 5 brothers and 1 sister were there. So were 5 of his nephews. The families of Anthony Hammett and Michael Green were represented as well. People who had waited decades, some of them their entire adult lives, for this night. Thomas Sheridan, one of Michael's brothers, had spent years lobbying the governor's office. He had written letters, made calls, kept the case alive in the memory of Florida's political machinery. When Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant on January 9, 2026, making Heath the first scheduled execution of the year, Thomas Sheridan was the one who called it the culmination of polite patience, dogged determination, and keeping hope alive. At the press briefing after the execution, Thomas Sheridan had a message for the governor. "A final thank you," he said, "for ordering the Ronald Palmer cocktail on January 9th for tonight's service. Governor, as we agreed, that goes on my bar tab." It was gallows humor from a man who had waited 36 years. The execution itself was documented by witnesses. When the curtain to the observation window went up at 6 p.m., Heath was already on the gurney, already res-tapped, for already inserted. Florida's 3-drug protocol, a sedative, a paralytic agent, and a drug to stop the heart, was administered in sequence. Heath showed almost no reaction. He closed his eyes. He appeared to fall asleep. He became motionless. A medic was called approximately 8 minutes after the drugs began flowing. At 6:12 p.m., Ronald Palmer Heath was declared dead. 10 years on Florida's death row for killing Michael Green at 16. 35 years on Florida's death row for killing Michael Sheridan at 27. A 3rd murder he was never charged for. And a brother, Kenneth, who is still alive, serving a life sentence, eligible for parole. Kimberly Reeves, Anthony Hammett's sister, stood outside the prison and said something that cut through all of it. She said Ronald Heath losing his life didn't change the facts. It didn't bring her brother back. She didn't delight in the death penalty. She hoped he was at peace. Rhonda Green, Michael Green's sister, the first victim, the one from 1977, said the execution didn't bring her happiness. But it was, she said, a necessary form of justice. "It's horrendous," she said, "that it took this long. 48 years from Michael Green's family. 36 from Michael Sheridan's. A lifetime of waiting. And still, outside the gates, the protesters rang their bells. Here is the question that the case of Ronald Palmer Heath will not let go of. Kenneth Heath pulled the trigger. 3 times. He shot Michael Sheridan in the chest, then twice in the head. Kenneth Heath is the one who fired the gun. He pleaded guilty, agreed to testify against his older brother, and was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 25 years. Ronald Heath stabbed the victim. He directed the robbery. He told his brother to keep shooting. He was the older sibling, the one prosecutors described as dominant, the one the trial court found had operated as the primary causal factor in Sheridan's death. He received the death penalty. Advocacy groups were clear in their position. Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty released a statement the night of the execution. Ronnie was put to death for a murder he did not commit. The undisputed triggerman in that crime, Ronnie's brother Kenneth, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. They called it a systemic failure. They pointed to what they described as reliance on incentivized testimony. Kenneth, after all, testified against his brother in exchange for his own life sentence. They raised the issue of a non-unanimous jury, 10-2 for death, with 2 jurors voting against it. They argued those 2 voices mattered. The state's position was equally consistent. 2 aggravating factors: prior violent felony, murder committed during armed robbery. The courts affirmed it at every level, over 35 years, across dozens of appeals. The Florida Supreme Court, the 11th Circuit, the U.S. Supreme Court. Every tribunal reviewed it and allowed it to stand. What the case of Ronald Palmer Heath also reveals is a broader story about Florida and capital punishment. According to state records, there are currently 251 inmates on Florida's death row. In 2025 alone, Governor DeSantis oversaw 19 executions, more in a single year than any Florida governor since the death penalty was reinstated in the United States in 1976. The previous record was 8, set in 2014. Nationally, 47 people were executed across the U.S. in 2025. Florida accounted for nearly half of them. Heath had proposed dying by firing squad rather than lethal injection, arguing in his final appeals that Florida had mismanaged its own protocols and that lethal injection risked causing him needless suffering. The courts rejected that argument. At 6:12 p.m. on February 10th, 2026, with his family absent and his last meal refused, with no spiritual counseling and only 3 words to leave behind: "I'm sorry," Ronald Palmer Heath became the first person executed in Florida in 2026. The second was already scheduled before his body was cold. Melvin Trotter, 65, was set to die on February 24th. Billy Leon Curse, 53, 1 week after that. The machinery does not pause. The families of Michael Green, Michael Sheridan, and Anthony Hammett went home that night. Some of them, for the first time in decades, may have slept without that particular weight. Others said plainly that nothing brought their loved ones back, that the execution was necessary but not healing, that justice and peace are not always the same thing. Rhonda Green waited 48 years for what she called any form of real justice. She got it in 2026. Whether it was enough, she did not say. Thomas Sheridan put it differently. He said his brother's ultimate judgment now belongs to God. He said he was glad he had a hand in getting to this point. And then he went home. 35 years on death row. 3 confirmed murder connections. 1 brother alive. 1 dead. A bar called the Purple Porpoise that closed in 2002. And a traveling salesman from Atlanta who bought 2 strangers a drink and almost didn't get in the car. Almost. The state of Florida says justice was served. Death penalty opponents say the wrong brother got the needle. The families of the victims say nothing will ever fill what was taken from them. Ronald Palmer Heath said, "I'm sorry. That's all I can say. Thank you. Make of that what you will." If this case raises questions for you about how death row really works, about how 2 men can commit the same crime and receive completely different sentences, then you need to watch our next video on how Florida's death row has changed since 1976. Subscribe, like, share, and comment.